Welcome to our episode of As We Go in Politics from Newford Radio. I'm Deidre Newby. In today's episode, we will discuss a very sensitive topic for some folks out there, the election. It's not going to be that bad because we're going to take a different approach in having this discussion. Our goal in this week's episode is not to closely evaluate each candidate that is running for the office. Instead, our goal is to help voters with a Christian background to understand candidates' stance on different issues and how their position corresponds with what the Bible teaches. We're not going to be able to cover every political issue each candidate is endorsing, but we will look at why politics should matter to all Christians. So, before we get started, welcome to our broadcast show, As We Go in Politics. We have a lot to cover today as we approach the midterm election. Recently, our CEO of our organization, Felicia Crawford, has been talking off and on a lot about the midterm election and emphasizing the importance of her staff participating in this process. Felicia and myself have engaged in quite a bit of conversation surrounding this upcoming election, whether one, should they or should they not, as a Christian, participate in the political process? And two, if they feel led to do so, who's God's backing? So we got a few points here that we're going to discuss, and I will try to make each subtitle as clear as possible as we continue this talking point discussion. Why politics matter. Let me start with a disclaimer before we get into our full discussion by saying this. You should, as a voter, never, ever do anything that the Lord is not prompting you personally to do. Now, anyone like me as a Bible teacher that shows you about matters that are more or less a personal decision, or what I like to also call a gray area of faith, need to proceed with caution. In other words, I'm referring to matters where you're not going to lose your salvation over a decision you make concerning a matter. But concerning these matters, you really need to make sure that the Lord is leading you and not people. Let me give you three examples. Two, I'm going to reference the Holy Scriptures concerning, and one from my own personal experience with Christ, or the gray area of faith that I refer to as, has also impacted those who are closest to me. And then we'll get into the main point of our discussion, which is the midterm election. Let's start with my first two examples, who so happen to have different spiritual gifting or administrative roles, but have the same spiritual limitation placed on them by God. That is, the prophet Samuel and Samson, who was one of God's judges in the Old Testament. Now, we're not going to focus on their individual assignments as God's prophet and judge. Instead, we're going to review the one quality that were similar between the two, and that was their Nazarite vow. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, a Nazarite is someone who vows to do three specific things for a specific period. 1, to abstain from wine. 2, to refrain from getting their hair cut. And 3, to avoid touching anything dead. This vow is continuous until either 1, the individual aborts, sins, or breaks his or her vow, or 2, he or she successfully completes his or her vow. The Nazarite vow falls under the priestly code, which you can find at Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 21, which we're not going to read. Now, individuals who agree to take on such a vow are set apart and made holy to the Lord. Not any or everyone are automatically allowed to take such a vow. You must be invited to do so by the Lord himself. And we can look at Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5 as an example. And this is the Lord providing to assign Jeremiah for a special purpose, to set him aside, to set him apart, to consecrate him, to make him holy for a special assignment. It says, Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you as a prophet to the nation. And we know Jeremiah's natural assignment was a priest, but God also invited Jeremiah to be a prophet to the nations during his era. And initially he wanted to reject that assignment, but at some point he did agree to accept that assignment. We've already established that such a vow, like the prophet Samuel and Samson, one of God's judges, are not a vow that's automatically a privilege for all Christians, but you have to be invited by God. Not only you have to be invited by God, then you must agree to take on what God is asking you to do. And we can read that at Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, where it says, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond this is evil. So basically here that it's kind of clear cut for us. God invites you and you accept that vow to do whatever it is that God is inviting you, the special assignment he's giving you, what he's setting you apart, what he's consecrating you for, what he's making you holy to do that no one else can do but you, because he's calling you to a specific special assignment for him. And if you said yes, it is a sin to abort or abandon your agreement with God. And then Luke goes on to further explain this by saying here, Luke 14:28, and it says, for which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? So before we give God our yes, we want to make sure we look at all the pros and cons, as we like to say, to be confident that no matter what comes up, we won't abandon our vow. And the reason this is also important is because God never forces us to agree with him or to do what he is asking us to do. We have a choice in the matter, but it is always in our best interest to do what God expects or asks of us. And we'll get into a little more details of why in a moment. So now getting back to the Nazarite vow, again, one is set apart or made holy to the Lord. In other words, they are on a special assignment from the Lord. This is not an assignment given to them by man or a leader in the church. These individuals who are invited by God to take on special assignments in the kingdom work, people that God select here on the earth for a specific special assignments, their assignment comes directly from the Lord. Please understand that. So during their eras, and I'm talking about again to the prophet Samuel and Samson, who was one of God's judges, during their eras of rule or conquest, both Samuel and Samson were restricted for certain things due to their Nazarite vow. And we need to know it was obvious that Samuel completed his vow based on the scriptures provides us as we read and study it. However, there were moments in Samson's life where he abandoned his vows. And again, that is clearly shown to us in the scriptures. The point we want to get here is that the Nazarite vow was not placed on other Christians. This was a special vow they were assigned in order to successfully complete their special assignment from the Lord. So, how does my personal experience fit with this? Well, many of you know my stance concerning participating and celebrating holidays. You can visit my YouTube page at the channel name is Deidra1, and you can watch the video. I don't think it's in any specific playlist, titled "Should Christians Celebrate Birthday?" which in that video I do mention other holidays. Now, no matter what your personal view or participation concerning such celebrations as Christmas, Easter, and other holidays, there is nothing anyone can show me from the scriptures. Let me repeat that part again. There is nothing anyone can show me from the scriptures that would convince me that we do not violate the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments every time we participate in any federal holidays, such as Easter, Christmas, etc. I'm sorry if you don't agree with me or if I offend you, but the scriptures and secular history are straightforward and accurate about these customs. So I took a vow a long time ago to God. I would not violate these commands by participating in such customs. And I haven't. Even when I was out there wilding out, I did not participate in these pagan customs, because that's what they are, pagan customs. All you have to do is do your historical research from a secular standpoint, and it's clear. You can't really avoid it. Now, I'm not bashing if anyone who may choose to do so. That's between you and God. But I'm only going to speak from my perspective. When I made the decision to do the research, when God prompted my heart, and I look and compare that with the scriptures, to me, they supported one another. And I made the decision that I will no longer participate years ago. It's been almost more than 20 years ago, and I have not participated in any federal holidays. Now, let me make this clear. It was not something one day I decided to do. That is not to celebrate any federal holidays, nor did I jump on some bandwagon because this was something others around me were doing. I gave prayerful consideration, and I did my due diligence by doing research that brought me to this decision. But I didn't get there on my own. No, God really dealt with me on these customs, and I was open to hear, research God's view and standard on these matters, both from a scriptural and a secular standpoint. And when I discovered the things that I discovered through my research, I obey. I relent, repent, and obey. Once I clearly understood it, to me, it did not matter what others believed, what they were doing or saying about these customs. Over time, I made the adjustment, and I have not looked back nor regret my decision ever since. Just like the Nazarite vow, this is a vow or restriction I feel the Lord personally was placing on me. But I don't force my vow on others. Over the years, when those in my inner circle start to question my stance, I refuse to engage them in conversations about my personal stance because I felt they weren't doing their due diligence, or they were being lazy about doing their own research first. And I'm not talking about the kind of research where one does research for the pure goal to prove they're right and I am wrong. I won't waste my time with those kinds of questioning conversations. The Bible refers to these types of conversations as fruitless debates, which is a sin. Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 and 21 states it this way. The acts of the flesh are obvious. And one of the acts of the flesh that verse mentioned is contention. And contention is a discord. And a discord is debates. I'm not getting involved in that. As I was mentioning earlier, when my inner circle, those who were very close to me, was inquiring why I refused to participate in customs and holidays that they were participating in, for months, I avoid having this type of conversation with my team about my stance. And like I said before, mainly because they refused to do their research first. But when several of them finally did their research one by one, several of them finally start to dig on their own, the historical evidence that's out there, and then comparing that with the Bible. And when they came back and inquired of me after they had done their research on their own, then I was able and willing to have a conversation with them, because now we're on a level plane. We're able to have a fair, loving, respectful dialogue with no biases, because now we both have the same and equal knowledge concerning these customs. And as a result of them doing their own research, today, everyone that I have had an in-depth conversation with about holidays, all have shifted their mindset concerning federal holidays. And each one of them are taking their steps as well to abandon such practices. And let me note, there is one federal holiday that I do acknowledge, that I do celebrate, and I've been doing so for the past 2 years, because in having conversations with these individuals about holidays, I discovered, because I had to go back and redo some research that I hadn't done in a while, I discovered all this time I could have been participating in Thanksgiving, but because the way church to typically do it is, to me, is still too commercial. When my family gets together here at my home to celebrate Thanksgiving, we take a more spiritual, biblical approach. I don't get caught up in the same customs that too many Christians do, which is your focus still is not on God. Focus more so is on family and the get together of family, which is not a bad thing in itself, and football. And that was not the focus that I want for my family. We don't even turn on the television when we get together for Thanksgiving. And we have a round table where we really focus on God. We read the scriptures and we talk about why we're thankful, and then we enjoy each other's company. It's how we spend Thanksgiving in my home. Okay, moving on. I share these examples because most likely none of us, meaning Samson, Samuel, and myself, will lose our salvation over saying no to God, that we don't want to fulfill a vow God is asking of us. And remember, a vow is the invitation by God and not by man for you to do a special assignment, a special task for God. So you're set apart, you're consecrated, you're made holy in order for the Lord, in order to complete this assignment, if you don't abort it or abandon it. Now, but we have to keep in mind, if we refuse not to fulfill the vow that God has asked of us, or if we abandon that vow, then it can cause us to miss out on some promises and or blessings that God has for us. So to kind of sum up this part here, vows can be considered like what I call gray areas of faith, or personal decisions between you and God, because that decision may directly affect only you, but it would not necessarily impact or affect other Christians. And I say that cautiously, because if God is giving you a special assignment, special task, that assignment is going to have people attached to it, people you need to influence and give a thorough witness to. So those individuals will be impacted, but that's not the point that I'm really making here. The point I'm making is when God invites you, he's inviting you and not other Christians for a special assignment. It's the main point I want you to walk away with. Now, from my study of the scriptures, the gray area of faith or personal decision that I mentioned earlier, this is the case also concerning politics. Let me say this disclaimer before I go further. No one, especially Christians, should be forced or shamed into participating in any election if you personally feel uncertain about the candidate and or God has not spoken to you concerning the candidates. Now, when I say God hasn't spoken to you, now this can be one of many different methods that God can speak to you. He can speak directly to you, or he can speak to you through a reliable, trustworthy leader. And I am not talking about any leaders. I am speaking about leaders who have a proven public track record in this area concerning politics. All right, so let's answer that question that we started off this conversation with. Why should politics matter to you? In general, people have a distrust and love-hate relationship with politics. And even though that's the case, I find this to be an interesting disposition for anyone considering that politics in itself influences and impacts every aspect of our lives. There is not an area in our life that politics does not have a say over. From how much tax you will pay for the coffee you love to get every morning, to rather morally speaking, we can or cannot do certain things. Politics influences all aspects of our life. Despite our world current direction of plunging into a cesspool of crime, terrorism, famine, plagues, and disease, it can be far worse without the interference of local, state politics. So we all can see how vital the world of politics is to each one of us as individuals, to our families and communities, to employers and employees, to profit and nonprofit organizations, as well as to our churches and ministries. Politics is an important and fundamental part of our lives. So it certainly does and should matter to each one of us, especially to the church. So now that leads us into our next section, to vote or not to vote. If you listen to some Christians, we should stay out of politics. This was a constant theme stated throughout the political charged 2020 election. I will spare you the pain by not getting sidetracked by going there this morning. Instead, let me start by reminding all Christians we are called to be salt and light in this culture. We see that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 16, and it reads, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt becomes tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under foot by men. You are the light of the world, and a city on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." We are also called to be witnesses to all the nations. And we see that in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20. "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. With that being said, we need to be mindful that politics matters to God. Therefore, he calls and uses political leaders, like men who serve him, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and even men who do not serve him, but they serve a divine purpose for God, like Donald Trump. And I am sorry if you cannot discern the divine operation of both of these men. When we consider men like DeSantis and how he runs his state, it is obvious that God is calling and wants some Christians to run for political office. Why? Politics directly impacts every part of Christians' life. So politics matters to God, and therefore it should matter to each one of us. The conflict comes in when man abuses politics. They abuse their position of authority as a political figure. And it also comes in when we, as servants of God, or people in general, put politics and men and women that function in these roles before God. Let's look at Exodus 20, verse 3 to compare that, which is the first commandment, that 10 commandment that God gave Moses. It says, "You shall have no other gods before me." When we as voters give too much worship, praise, attention to these political figureheads, like too many Christians have done with Donald Trump, whenever this happens, God may reach a point where he can no longer use a person for his purpose because we begin to idolize these political figures. Verse 4 of that same chapter says, "You shall not make yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters under the earth." And this would include men and women who are in political positions or political clout or power. Now, when we as Christians start to idolize, worship, praise, give too much attention to political figures like Donald Trump, and as I mentioned before, it may trigger God to where he can no longer use these individuals for the divine purpose in which he had raised them for. Now, I am not saying this is the case with Donald Trump, for I personally am still praying that the truth will come out about the 2020 election and God's choice for that election. And when and if the truth does come out before the completion of the current, I can't even fix my mouth to call him president, the completion of Joe Biden's administration before his presidential term has completed, I pray that, like I said before, that the truth comes out concerning the fraudulent behavior during the 2020 election, and God's chosen vessel, the one that God wanted to be in office, would be restored. However, that is beginning to look, and this is my opinion, this is not what the Spirit of the Lord has spoken to me. What I'm about to say is my opinion. That possibility is beginning to look less and less because of the reaction and behavior of too many Christians who have fallen in the trap of idolizing, putting on too high of a pedestal, violating Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 and 4 concerning God's commandment of not putting anything before him. But let's move on. So when we consider the points made thus far, and we're going to look at some other additional points that I'm about to also consider, I personally believe that all Christians should participate in both the presidential and midterm election. Again, let God speak to you personally. Be careful to consider each candidate's platform. Oftentimes, when we look at the platform that many of these candidates running on, and when I say platform, I mean their visions, the laws that they want to implement if they are put into office. Oftentimes, this will give us a clear indication who God is for and who he isn't. And in a moment, you should see on your screen an example of this from the 2020 presidential election. You will see what visions, what platform Joe Biden was running on. I'm not listing them all. I'm just listing just a few that contradicts or either supports the scriptures, God's stance. And then you will also see President Donald Trump's, his political views, the points he ran on during the election. It should have been clear evidence to all Christians who God was backing. And let me quote something Prophetess Felicia Crawford that she mentioned in several videos at least a year before during the 2016 and 2020 presidential candidate for office. The Spirit of the Lord was behind, and she named the candidate who she felt God's Spirit was behind. This is what the Spirit of the Lord was speaking to her at that time, and at that time it was Donald Trump in both cases. Felicia went on and also said recently, politics should never be about who we like or do not like. It should always be about who the Spirit of the Lord is pointing to. End of quote. Now, Satan's goal concerning election. Saints have two primary goals concerning all elections: to keep all of us in bondage and to put up barriers that will prevent us from participating in any election, especially Christians. The reason why he wants to keep us in bondage and keep us from participating in the political process, i.e., political election, presidential and midterm, so we all can remain in bondage, it would make it easier for him to get into office those who would do his bidding. For example, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot is a prime example. I won't go there, but all you have to do is look at her platform when she was running as a candidate. You can look at the lifestyle that she preferred, the disunity that has formed in her administration since her inauguration, and the increase of crime, violence, etc. in her region since her installment as mayor of the city of Chicago. It is obvious the Spirit of the Lord is certainly not behind Laura Lightfoot. But moving on. As long as we as Christians refuse to prayerfully consider who God is considering for all elections, both presidential and midterm elections, Satan is completely satisfied. In this way, he maintains his political stronghold over God's people. Let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. It says, even though this is referring to the world, but this can apply to Christians too, who allow themselves to be influenced this way. In case the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelieving, so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of God, who is the image of God. And of course, the God that is talking about here, when you dig a little deeper into your own research on that verse, is Satan, the devil. And of course, it's talking about unbelievers, those who are not a part of God's kingdom. The principle can also applied to Christians. All right, so God's kingdom is a government. Now, let me make sure we all understand this clearly. God runs, oversees, and operates a kingdom. What is a kingdom? The number 2 entry in the Westford Dictionary defines a kingdom as, and I quote, the internal kingship of God. Oh my God, that's powerful. The realm in which God's will is fulfilled. Yes. The Westford Thesaurus also describe it as a region of activity, knowledge, and influence. So we need to be mindful of this. In order to have activities and enforce knowledge in place, someone has to possess influence. So let's now look at the term government. That same dictionary says a government is a body of persons that constitute the governing authority of political unit or organization. So there you have it. Government and kingdom work hand in hand. Whether you're reading the New or Old Testament, according to contributing writer for the Christian Carrier, Wayne Jackson, he stated in one of his articles that the term kingdom is found 162 times in the New Testament. The Answer search engine website indicated that the word kingdom appeared 369 times in the Old Testament. Now, let me state this as a disclaimer. I did not verify those 2 facts. If something is mentioned that many times in the Holy Scriptures, I would assume it is a very important from God's perspective. God's kingdom has a king, which we know to be Jesus Christ, who operates similar to our U.S. presidents, just with more authority. God's kingdom on the earth for centuries were operated by a king with the support of God's prophet. And I'm not going to read that, but if you turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8, we'll see that. And in that chapter, there are a few verses where it shows us when the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, started to ask God for a king to rule over them because they wanted to be like the other nations. So in the scriptures, when we study the hierarchy and political climate of God's kingdom and compare that to how we as mankind set up our government, we will see there is not much of a difference. A close study of the scriptures can prove to you that God is concerned about governmental things and appoints individuals according to his whim, will, and purpose. We see that in Daniel chapter 2, 20 and 21. Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the time and the seasons. He removed kings and established kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding." So God appoints men in governmental places for his divine purpose. Just to give you a few examples, we know that the 3 Hebrew boys, as well as their companion Daniel, were all appointed as government officials. In particular, the Babylonian government, Daniel held one of the most highest position in Babylon, Medo Persia, and I can't think of the third government kingdom that he became a political leader in. And then just considering the King Nebuchadnezzar, who Daniel operated under, and even King Darius, who was over Media Persia political government, who Daniel also operated under. These were kings that God allowed, put into position to fulfill a specific purpose that God had. During the kingdomship of Nebuchadnezzar, God was judging his people for their disobedience. And then when God decided to free his people after they finally repent and got right with God, God brings in Darius, again, a man that does not serve God, to free his people. So we see God establishes and removes kings, political figures, as he pleases. With this being the case, God is very much involved in human politics, and so should all Christians. So we're going to close out with this. Our conscience plays a role. Let me restating what I said in the beginning of this talking point discussion. Do not let others' political views or conscience force or shame you into participating in any election process, selecting any candidate you are not sure about, or more importantly, God has not spoken to you concerning. Prayerfully allow God to lead you in this area. For any candidate we endorse, support, advocate for, defend, or vote for, we are signing off and agreeing with their agenda. If their political agenda is dangerous, vices to mankind's order, as well as violate God's standard and structure for mankind, we will share in their political party's heresy, and we can end up reaping their judgment if we do not repent from such bad decisions. Well, that's the end of my talking point today. Again, my name is Deidre with Newford Radio, and this was the discussion about midterm election. The main point of this particular talking point is, should Christians participate in voting? And based on the information I shared with you here today and my personal perspective, and just digging in closely in the scriptures, yes, all Christians should participate in presidential and midterm elections. But the key part is to make sure the win is behind, the Spirit of the Lord is behind such candidates, because we want to support the agenda of those who have God's blessing of being appointed by God, set apart, consecrated, made holy for political reasons for the Lord.